Okay, so welcome everybody to long-term care planning. Today I have a presentation that will cover 4 points about long-term care. So the first is what is long-term care? And then we'll talk a little bit about the various settings that long-term care can take place. We'll also talk about the costs of long-term care because it isn't cheap. And then lastly, what are some financial strategies that we can implement into your plan to pay for long-term care? And again, at the very end, I will do a Q&A session. So as we go through the presentation, if you have any questions, please feel free to drop it in the chat. I will then address it at the very end. All right, so first and foremost, what is long-term care? Now, this is something that is defined by the National Institute of Aging, and it's defined as a variety of services that are designed to meet people's health and or personal care needs so that they can live as independently and safely as possible when they can no longer perform everyday activities on their own. And really, it's categorized into 6 different activities of daily living. ADLs is what they deem it. So these are things that if you can't perform on your own, it may be time to consider long-term care. So these are categorized as bathing, dressing, eating, transferring, so moving from a bed to a wheelchair or just walking around, toileting, and incontinence. Now, with each of these 6 ADLs, you can either have very hands-on care. So that would be a caregiver basically with you 24/7 to make sure that you can perform these daily activities of daily living. Or you can have standby care where maybe you just have limited needs for help. Maybe it's one of the 6 and not all 6 of them. But either way, a lot of the long-term care definitions when it comes to insurance coverage is that you need to hit at least 2 out of the 6 ADLs where you're not able to perform those things. That's when long-term care kicks in. So there has been many studies that have been done, and they ask people, well, what percentage of people do we think need long-term care? And there's actually quite a big discrepancy between the expectation of needing long-term care and the reality of it. So when the survey was performed in 2020, there's about only 8% of people that replied and said that they think that they need long-term care. But in reality, when the study was done and they checked back in, actually closer to 70% of those who were over the age of 65 needed long-term care. That's a big number discrepancy. And personally, I have many clients who we've had these conversations. Maybe it's something that it's not super near term, so people don't necessarily think about it, or it's such an overwhelming topic that they kind of delay it and they don't really want to think about it. And so I hope that today's presentation will get everybody thinking and having these conversations with your financial planner to best plan for any long-term care needs. So what are the various settings that long-term care can take place? Most commonly, and this is one that I hear most often, is people want to age in place because they want to be at home. That's where they're the most comfortable. There's probably more misconceptions around the fact that long-term care has to take place in a facility. That's just simply not true. There's a lot of in-betweens before you get into a facility. And with the at-home care, you can either have caregivers come full-time, part-time. You can even have nurses come and check in, give the medication. So it really just depends on the level of care that you need. Also, with at-home care, if you're currently living in a house that's maybe a 2-story house, and we need to convert maybe the bottom floor of the house into something that's usable, that can all be done. It just needs to be planned, right? So at-home care is most commonly what we see. There's also community-based care, and then I'll talk about independent living all the way up to nursing home. But with community-based care, this is mainly if you're still at home, but you're missing some of the social aspects of it. There's definitely adult daycares and things like that where you can do outings. Now with the independent living, assisted living, and nursing home, sometimes those three are grouped together because the facilities that offer it offer these various stages. So with independent living, this is more so you purchase maybe in a 55 and up community and you still have your own house. You can still perform all the normal tasks and you don't really need as much help in the house. And so you have that community among you within a 55 and up. You're still independently living just as if you were at your own home, but maybe it's within like a CCBC, which is, you know, a community type situation. Now, if you needed a tad more care, but not necessarily in a nursing home where you need 24/7 care, perhaps assisted living might be a good in between. So with assisted living, you have options where you can have nurses come and check in on you. They provide things like laundry services. There's meal plans, so you don't have to think about your meals. There's a lot of activities that are planned. And so with assisted living, it's a great in between so that you still have your community, you have some sense of independence, but the care is there should you need to move up into a little bit more assistance and nursing home. So those are the various long-term care settings that are available. Of course, it depends on what your preference is, and talk with your planner to plan out what those costs and how that might look. So now let's jump over to the cost of long-term care. The 300,000 number that you see on the left there is an approximate medical expense number for non-long-term care medical care. So this is simply things like as you age, and unfortunately, Medicare doesn't cover all of your healthcare costs. So as you age, there is bound to be additional medical expenses. And through Genworth, which is a study that was done, it's approximately $300,000 average for a couple for non-long-term care medical related costs. That's not a small number, but if you think about it, that's the average for the time that you retire pretty much all the way until death. It's around $300,000. Now add in if you were to need long-term care in some degree, whether it's at home, rebuilding your house, or getting into an assisted living facility. The middle column shows the national median of what it would cost for one person to get into to have long-term care. So it ranges, right, from 51,000 all the way up to 105,000, depending on what your needs are. That 105,000 is probably closer to if you needed a private room in a nursing home on a national average. And then the 51.6 is probably closer to if you just needed a caregiver here and there, you pay them hourly. So that's why there's that big of a range. Now, what about some costs in the Portland metro area? So that's going to be the third column. It's slightly higher than the national median. So here in Portland, it can range anywhere from 76,000 all the way up to 183,000. Not a small number. And again, the reason why there's such a big range is because of the various services and the facility and all the amenities that you might want. So when I'm sitting down with clients and building out long-term care costs, typically I err on the high side just because we don't know when you might need long-term care. And we'll talk through sort of what your idea of a comfortable retirement in one of those settings might be. So that's to give you a general idea of what it may cost for long-term care. Now, another fact that I typically build in is generally women tend to need long-term care later in life compared to men. And so that's just based off of the fact that studies have shown women tend to live longer. And so I take all of that into consideration when we're talking about long-term care costs and building that into your financial plan. So what about Medicare? I get this question a lot, and clients are, you know, they've paid into the Medicare system and they assume that Medicare will take care of all of their medical needs. In part, that's true, but more likely than not, it's not true. So as it relates to long-term care, Medicare only pays for your short-term stay in a skilled nursing facility when you're going through rehab. So that's the key there. Medicare will only pay for your long-term care costs if you're in a rehabilitation facility where you're going to get better. A lot of times when people think about long-term care, it's more of a long time horizon that they're staying in a facility. It's not just rehab that's less than 90 days. So in those situations, Medicare does not pay for your long-term care costs, like your independent living, buying into a 55 and up community, assisted living support, nursing home, any of those services, Medicare does not cover. So that's important to know so that we can plan in addition to that. The other thing that we hear a lot is, well, if Medicare doesn't cover it and we end up spending down all of our assets, then let's just have Medicaid kick in and pay for it. So many of you know Medicaid is a government funded program for eligible low-income adults. However, there's a lot of caveats when it comes to Medicaid. And the top three that I typically talk about is that when you do need Medicaid, they look at your assets and your income. So typically, in order to qualify for Medicaid, you have to use up all of your assets down to about $2,000. And then there's an income threshold as well for how much money you can make income-wise, both in Social Security, any pensions, retirement withdrawals, things like that. And it's a pretty small number. For 2024, I want to say it's like $2,600 a month. So it's a pretty low threshold. And usually one person will need Medicaid, potentially apply for Medicaid, and maybe the other spouse isn't. So in that instance, they'll also look at the joint and leave a threshold for the non-Medicaid spouse. So they can still keep their home, they can still have their Social Security. So there's different income limits for those situations. But the key there is that you have to use up your assets and you have to have very limited income. Number two, there's something called a look back period with Medicaid. So that's generally 5 years where they look back and see if you had made big transfers out of your accounts to get rid of those assets. They're going to flag that and say that that's not, you can't do that, and that disqualifies you from qualifying for Medicaid. So there's a 5-year look back period when they take in your application and they look at all those things. The third thing is Medicaid typically doesn't get you the best service. There's no more room at the inn and you're probably forced to move out. So situations like this where I've seen maybe clients are able to afford assisted living or nursing home, they spend down their assets, now they have to be on Medicaid, and then not every single facility offers the same level of service for Medicaid eligible people, residents who stay there. So sometimes, and this is awful, but they will move you from the room or the house that you were in before when you were paying with your own assets. Once you're Medicaid, it's a whole nother ball game, and it's probably going to be worse service, not the type of assisted living or nursing home situation that you had paid for originally. So those are the things to consider if, you know, Medicaid is something that plays into your financial picture, and we can talk more about that. So what are some ways that people have been paying for long-term care because it's so expensive? Well, back in the late 70s, that's when they first came out with the original long-term care insurance. I have a handful of clients who still have original long-term care insurance from policies that were purchased a long time ago. If you've ever heard in the news or heard any sort of litigations about original long-term care insurance, it's because they were always overly funded by insurance companies. So what happened was it was introduced in the late 70s. Care options were pretty limited, but it did expand in the 80s. A bunch of people bought into it because they were like, wow, that's a great deal. I can pay a premium every single year, get long-term care insurance. And then when I need to go into a home, I can tap into this insurance to pay for that. Well, what ended up happening was the insurance companies didn't realize that all of these claims were going to come through pretty much around the same time from these people who bought the policies 30, 40 years ago. So the reason why when you hear original long-term care insurance, a lot of people are like, ooh, that's a terrible product. It's because the insurance companies didn't have enough money to pay those claims, which is just awful, because now that people are dipping into the long-term care insurance, that's when they need it the most, and they're not getting paid out. So some of those policies actually got shut down. Some of those insurance companies went away, they went belly up. So there has been a lot of reform when it comes to long-term care insurance. Nowadays, the long-term care insurance has definitely improved. So this is referring to just standalone long-term care insurance that you purchase and you pay a premium for, and then they promise a X amount of benefit that you can access later on. A lot of improvements have been made, like now they include dementia and Alzheimer's, whereas before it didn't. They also include now a cost of living adjustment. So what long-term care or nursing homes cost today is not going to be what it costs 10 years from now. So they started building in this inflation rider so that we can keep up with how expensive it's going to be. So they have made a lot of adjustments to it. It's improved, but it's not the only strategy that we can utilize when planning for long-term care. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the other financial strategies that we can look at and implement into your plan depending on where you're at. So the first thing is, now they have, instead of just standalone long-term care insurance, they have something called a hybrid policy. So this is where you purchase life insurance, just like anybody would if they wanted to protect their family. What life insurance does is you pay a premium. There's a death benefit that is promised to your family should you pass away. Same thing with annuities. And now they have added this long-term care benefit rider that you can tack on to your life insurance policy. This has worked well for certain situations where potentially you're a little bit younger and you can qualify for cheaper premiums on life insurance. Maybe you buy a policy with a $500,000 death benefit, for example. And so with the hybrid policy, if you never needed long-term care, that's fine. Upon your passing, the death benefit goes to your beneficiaries tax-free, which is the original reason why people purchase life insurance in the first place. But let's just say you did need to access your long-term care rider because you're now in an assisted living facility and there's a monthly charge of $10,000. So you can utilize these life insurance policies if you have the long-term care benefit and basically draw down your death benefit to pay for your long-term care needs. So what ends up happening is you have $500,000 to use, for example, and you pay for long-term care needs, you use up $300,000 of it, well, then your heirs or your beneficiaries will just get the remainder $200,000. So it has definitely helped and worked in instances, but again, it's not the only option available now when we're considering long-term care. So life insurance and annuities with long-term care rider, good option. Another one is, a lot of times, once you get to your 80s, 90s, you've probably owned your house for quite some time, and that becomes one of the biggest assets that you own. And so sometimes people will sell their current house, take that lump sum, and maybe use that to purchase their independent living house, right, in a 55 and up community. But what if it was someone who wanted to age in place and they still want to keep their house? They're still able to do things at home, but they just need a little bit more assistance and they don't have other financial assets, or that they don't want to tap into their financial assets. They can use the equity of their home to pay for some of the caregiving needs. So two options here. You could put a reverse mortgage on a home that you already own. And how that would work is you basically pull off of the equity of your house, and that's taken out as a loan. So there's no disbursements and there's no tax on taking equity out of your home under a reverse mortgage. And you kind of use that as your cash flow to pay for your care. Or you can take a conventional HELOC, which is a home equity line of credit, basically borrowing against your equity in your home. There's an interest rate attached to it. It can be structured in many different ways. But the key is that if you do own your home at that point, you can turn that into a way to pay for long-term care as well. And there's different ways that you can structure that. Another one that I see often is in pre-tax savings. So many of our clients have traditional IRAs. These are retirement accounts. They have 401ks that have been rolled into these traditional IRAs, or they have Roth IRAs. So what is the difference between a traditional IRA and a Roth IRA? Your traditional IRA is funded with all pre-tax dollars. So when you put your money in the traditional IRA, you get that tax deduction up front. It grows tax-free. And when you do take distributions out of the traditional IRA, you pay taxes as ordinary income on the amount that you take out. Very normal, very standard. We have lots of clients with traditional IRAs. You can utilize those disbursements to pay for long-term care if you needed. Another option is Roth IRAs. So different than the traditional IRA in the sense that all of your contributions that go into the Roth IRA have already been taxed. So you don't pay any taxes when you take it out. You also don't pay any taxes on the growth of your Roth IRA. So there's also been instances where the Roth IRAs have actually been a fantastic tool to use to pay for long-term care because any of those distributions are tax-free. You're not bumping yourself up to the next tax bracket when you take money out of the Roth IRAs. In recent years, we've also done a lot of conversions with our clients. And what that means is we move money from your traditional IRA into your Roth IRA so that you can have the flexibility of the tax-free distribution from the Roth. So talk to us about it if you haven't. We're definitely happy to take a look at your situation and see how we can utilize your hard-earned retirement nest egg to pay for long-term care if that's what's needed. Lastly, there's things called HSAs. So this is a health savings account. How these work is you put pre-tax money into a health savings account. There's some caveats here because in order to qualify for an HSA, you have to be on a certain health insurance plan, and there's contribution thresholds and maximums for HSAs. But the really cool thing about HSAs is when you put pre-tax money into it, you can invest it just like an IRA. It grows tax-free. When you take that money out and use it for qualified medical expenses, also tax-free. So it's a triple tax benefit in that sense because you're putting pre-tax dollars, growing tax-free, and then distributions are tax-free as well. The other neat thing about HSAs is that you can actually use the money in HSAs to pay for the premium of your long-term care or life insurance policy if it's a qualified policy. So various ways that we can use HSA, definitely talk to us because there's different tax considerations with HSA, but it's definitely a flexible type of health account. So all in all, what are some of the factors you should consider when we're sitting down and making a long-term care plan? First and foremost, what is your age and your marital status? Because that will determine what strategy we might use. Your health, right? If we're considering doing life insurance and adding a long-term care rider, your health matters because they're going to do an underwriting just like any other life insurance and see what you qualify for. Where you live is something to consider as well, whether you stay in the Portland metro area or you want to be a snowbird and go live in Arizona or Florida. That is important to consider as well. Sometimes clients who have military service will have various benefits that are offered to them, and we want to take that into consideration. Of course, family history, so longevity, any diseases or anything that needs to play into this long-term care picture we would want to talk about and know about. Financial assets, that's a big one. So we can see where we can move things around and pull from whenever it's necessary. And then, of course, we provide these services here, but retirement and other financial planning and your legacy and estate plan, all of that we want to think about when we're considering putting together your long-term plan specifically for you, because everybody's different. And so you should have a plan that is aligned with what you envision that to look like years from now. So I'll leave you with 3 questions to consider when you're thinking about your long-term care plan with your advisor, with your spouse. Number 1 is, who is going to provide that care? Is it going to be family members for some time? It can get a little straining when it's family members. We've experienced that personally. And so, something to think about. Where do you want the care to take place? What sorts of independent living situations might pique your interest here in the Portland metro area? What sorts of communities are you looking for? What amenities do you want? And then lastly, how will you pay for the care? And that's obviously something that we can help address. But to get the conversation started, at least, I would start thinking about these three things. So 3 long-term care points to keep in mind, and I will wrap up this presentation and jump over to Q&A. But number 1, everyone's situation is unique. Talk to your planner, talk with your spouse, talk with your family members to see what that situation might look like for you. Obviously, nobody really knows when they're going to need long-term care, but at least having these conversations of where do you want it, how do you want it, and how are we going to pay for it is going to alleviate a lot of that stress later on. The second point is you can definitely receive care at home. It's not one or the other. You don't need to, get kicked out of your house and then go live in a nursing home alone. There's a lot of in-betweens to get to plan for before you get to that point. And then lastly, your plan doesn't have to cover all of the possible costs, right? This is something that we talk to clients all the time about. Let's see what the estimated costs are going to be of how do we plan out all these things. And then if we have at least a plan and a direction, we don't have to consider every single possible thing that could happen, other than we know that, we have these things set aside and this is the plan that we have. So hopefully this was a helpful presentation to start the conversation at least, or if you want to check with any of us here at FIT, your advisor, in putting together a plan, please reach out to us. We are here for you. We would love to put something together specifically for your situation so that this can just be as least stressful as possible, because I've had a few clients go through this recently and it's not fun, and these conversations are tough. So we are here for you. I am going to stop the recording and then open up the chat to see what we have going on there. And feel free to unmute and jump on, say hi on the camera if you have questions, but I will also go through the chat too.